Imagine a king who ruled longer than anyone else in human history, but whose legacy isn't great monuments or golden statues. Instead, his legacy is 50,000 children vanishing without a trace. Imagine a dynasty lasting 94 years, where honey wasn't harvested for food, but to coat living bodies as bait for insects. This is the terrifying true story of Pepi II, the monster masquerading as a god who single-handedly brought down a glittering civilization. Picture this scene. You are standing in a torch-lit chamber deep beneath the Egyptian desert. The year is 2200 BC. You are a young soldier summoned at midnight with strange orders: bring honey 10 full jars of it, and tell absolutely no one where you are going. Right now you are watching servants pour that thick golden liquid over a naked boy standing on a stone platform. The honey coats every inch of his trembling skin until he gleams in the flickering torchlight. The boy has been trained not to speak, not to cry, not to move. But his eyes are different. His eyes are screaming. You hear a buzzing sound. Thousands of wings. Clay jars around the room begin to shake violently. Inside those jars are 3 types of creatures. Scarab beetles that have been starved for 5 days. Fire ants collected from Nubian valleys and fed on blood. And wasps bred specifically for aggression kept agitated by smoke. But there is a 4th container in the corner. And what is inside that one will haunt Egyptian nightmares for the next 4,000 years. The Pharaoh enters. He is 96 years old, though some sources say 100. He has ruled Egypt for 90 years ever since he was 6. He has outlived 8 generations of his own descendants. His name is Pepi II, and what happens next will be systematically erased from Egyptian records, yet whispered about by priests, documented by foreign observers, and discovered in mass graves that make modern archaeologists want to quit their jobs. With a single gesture from his withered hand, the servants release the insects. First come the beetles, a living carpet of black shells swarming over the honey-coated skin. Each beetle begins to eat their mandibles designed to tear through hides far tougher than human flesh. The boy tries not to move, but his muscles betray him, twitching and spasming as dozens of beetles bite simultaneously. Then come the ants, rivers of fire following the trails of honey. Each ant injecting venom that burns exactly like their name suggests. By the time the wasps arrive, the boy's face has already begun to swell. But the wasps ensure that within minutes his features are unrecognizable, distorted into a mask of agony that barely looks human. The screams echoing off these specially designed walls are not just from pain. They come from the realization that this is entertainment, that his suffering is a performance, that the ancient Pharaoh sitting on that golden throne is leaning forward not in horror, but in fascination. Occasionally he calls out adjustments like a movie director perfecting a scene. More honey on the feet. Release another wave of ants. Let the beetles concentrate on the softer areas. This torture session will last 3 hours. The boy will survive, but barely. He will be taken to recovery chambers where skilled physicians will keep him alive, not out of mercy, but out of economics. He is an expensive item to replace. He will heal over weeks, fed special foods to restore his strength, treated with salves to minimize scarring. And then when he is recovered just enough, it will happen again. And again. Until he grows too old for the Pharaoh's taste, or dies from accumulated trauma. This boy is just one of approximately 50,000 children who will disappear into Pepi's chambers over a 94-year reign. But before I tell you how a 6-year-old child became history's most prolific predator, before I explain how an entire civilization restructured itself to feed one man's appetites, you need to understand something historians rarely discuss. Pepi II was not born evil. He was crafted. He was shaped. He evolved through a perfect storm of unlimited power, childhood trauma, and 9 decades of never facing a single consequence. What you are about to learn is not just ancient history. It is a blueprint that repeats whenever humans gain absolute power for too long. This is the story of how a traumatized child became a god, how a god became a monster, and how 50,000 children brought down the greatest empire on earth by their absence. But before diving into the darkest parts of ancient civilizations, if you enjoy uncovering the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. Every monster has an origin story. For Pepi II, it began in 2278 BC with blood betrayal and a coronation that would shatter a 6-year-old mind into something unrecognizable. His father, Pepi II, died from what officials called a scorpion sting. It is strange how that scorpion managed to bypass 14 guards, navigate through 4 locked doors, avoid 2 food tasters sleeping in the antechamber, and deliver a fatal sting that left a wound matching the exact width of a bronze dagger. Even stranger was how the Crown Prince Pepi's older brother died the same week from river fever, despite being deep in the desert for 3 months, nowhere near water. That left little Neferkare, known as Pepi, the 4th son, nobody expected to matter. A quiet boy who played with wooden soldiers and followed his mother around the women's quarters. A child so far from succession that no one had bothered to train him for power. Within 7 days, he would be covered in blood, crowned as a living god, and discover something dark within himself that would grow for the next 9 decades. The coronation of a pharaoh was designed to transform a human into the divine. But what happens when you perform this ritual on a mind too young to understand the difference between symbol and reality? What happens when a 6-year-old truly believes he has become a god? The ceremony began at dawn. The priests stripped the child naked before 3,000 watching nobles. A white bull specially raised for this moment was led into the hall. Its throat was cut with such precision that the blood fountained directly into a golden basin large enough to bathe in. The bull's eyes were still blinking when they lifted the child and plunged him into that pool of blood. He was held under until his lungs burned, until his child's body thrashed in panic until the moment before drowning. Then they pulled him up gasping and crimson, expecting the normal reaction of a terrified 6-year-old, tears, screaming the desperate need for his mother. Instead, little Pepi laughed. Not nervous laughter, not hysteria, but the delighted giggle of a child who had discovered something wonderful. He looked at his blood-covered hands with fascination, licked his fingers to taste it, then asked the priests if he could go under again. The high priest would later write in his private journal that in 40 years of conducting ceremonies, he had never felt such cold terror as when that child smiled through a mask of blood. But the ritual had only begun. Now came the test to prove divine right to rule power over death itself. A prisoner was brought forward, some minor thief expecting execution, but not like this. He was forced to kneel before the blood-soaked child. The priests handed Pepi a ceremonial bronze blade, a weapon made for adult hands that the 6-year-old could barely lift. The instructions were simple. Remove the head. Prove that the god's power flows through you. The first strike missed entirely. The weight of the blade pulled the child off balance, and he tumbled forward into the pooling blood. The court held its breath. Would he cry? Would this break the illusion? Would he prove himself just a frightened child after all? Pepi stood up slowly, studying the blade with the concentration of a student learning to write. He adjusted his grip, planted his feet differently, and tried again. The second strike caught the prisoner's shoulder, opening a gash that sprayed blood across the front row of nobles. The third shattered teeth. The fourth opened the throat but failed to sever the spine. Any other child would have stopped when the prisoner stopped moving. But Pepi continued strike after strike, learning with each swing, adjusting his technique based on what worked and what didn't. It took 11 blows before the head finally separated. By then, the prisoner had been dead for several minutes, but the child Pharaoh did not stop until the job was complete. Then came the moment that revealed what Pepi would become. He picked up the severed head, looked into its dead eyes, and whispered something. When asked what he had said, the new Pharaoh replied with words that would define his reign. He said he had asked the head what death tasted like, and though it could not answer, he thought he understood anyway. Death, he declared, tasted like power. A 6-year-old child covered in blood holding a severed head, philosophizing about the flavor of mortality. This was not trauma creating dysfunction. This was revelation, the moment young Pepi discovered what he would spend 94 years exploring. The coronation was not finished. 23 women stood before the new Pharaoh, his father's secondary wives, whom tradition demanded accompany the dead king to the afterlife. The youngest was 14, married just months before. The oldest was 32, mother to 3 of Pepi's half-siblings. Custom called for poisoned wine, quick, dignified ceremonial. But the 6-year-old god king had been transformed by blood and violence. He wanted to understand death, to see it happen slowly enough to observe every detail. He ordered the women strangled with silk cords, but slowly, with pauses to let them recover before continuing. He sat on a throne so large his feet dangled like the child he was, but his eyes belonged to something else entirely. For 4 hours, he watched 23 women die. He did not look away once. He occasionally asked the executioners to adjust their technique, to vary the pressure, to try different angles. He wasn't just watching, he was studying. Learning the exact moment when panic turned to acceptance, when the body stopped fighting, when the light left the eyes. Then came their children, 41 half-siblings, who could potentially challenge his rule someday. The boys were strangled like their mothers. But for the girls, Pepi created something new. They had to choose their fate while watching their families die. Serve him forever or join their mothers in death. They had to decide in the moment of maximum grief and terror. 6 chose servitude. They would spend years wishing they had chosen death. One of these girls would survive to tell her story decades later. She described how, even as a 6-year-old, Pepi was fascinated by fear. He would keep them in a special wing of the palace, visiting at random hours simply to watch them. He wanted to see how terror affected their breathing, their movement, their sleep. He was particularly interested in the moment when fear became so intense that the mind simply shut down what he called the divine silence. By age 8, Pepi had discovered that certain poisons caused paralysis without death. He spent months testing different combinations, documenting which mixtures allowed victims to remain conscious but unable to move. He treated this research with the same seriousness as learning to read hieroglyphs. His tutors were required to help him organize his findings, creating detailed scrolls about the varieties of suffering. At age 9, he made a philosophical breakthrough that would shape his entire reign. Pain, he realized, was not singular, but multiple. Like wine could be sweet or bitter, suffering came in flavors. The pain of burning was different from cutting, which was different from poison, which was different from insects. He began categorizing types of agony with the dedication of a scholar, creating what he called his great work, a comprehensive exploration of every form of human suffering. The incident that showed how deeply this obsession had taken root occurred when he was 10 during morning court with the entire government assembled. A cat caught a bird in the throne room. The bird's wing was broken, but it was still alive, fluttering desperately while the cat played with it. There were urgent matters to discuss. A minor famine threatened Upper Egypt. Foreign ambassadors waited with tribute. Military reports warned of raiders on the borders. Pepi stopped everything to watch. For 1 hour, the most powerful nation on earth waited while a child god observed nature's cruelty. When a courtier politely suggested continuing with state business, Pepi had him beaten until he lost consciousness. The pharaoh's attention was divine. To interrupt it was blasphemy. When the bird finally died, Pepi called the cat to him, fed it treats from his own plate, and declared it sacred. Any cat that killed slowly, he announced, was performing holy work. They were demonstrating the truth. He had discovered that death was not a moment, but a process. And that process was the most important thing in existence. At 11, Pepi wrote a letter that perfectly captures his transformation from disturbed child to systematic predator. His general Harkuf was returning from Nubia with exotic gifts, including a pygmy dancer. Most of the letter seems like childish excitement about an unusual present, but the full text reveals something darker. Pepi demanded the dwarf be checked 10 times each night. Every 48 minutes, someone had to confirm he was still alive and undamaged. If the dwarf died before reaching Memphis, every sailor's children would be fed to crocodiles while their fathers watched. If he escaped, every soldier would be impaled. If he arrived injured, Harkuf himself would experience the same injuries tenfold. But the most revealing part was the postscript usually omitted from translations. Pepi requested that Harkuf also bring a normal child of the same weight as the dwarf. He wanted to conduct comparisons to see if size affected how long someone could survive without water, how they reacted to pain, whether their screams had different pitches. The dwarf was not entertainment. He was a research subject. By age 16, watching was no longer enough. Pepi needed to participate. The transformation from observer to actor began with the servants' children. Palace workers were required to bring their sons for blessing by the god king. These blessings happened in private chambers. The children entered healthy. They left damaged. Some never left at all. The first documented incident that Egyptian records could not completely hide occurred when Pepi was 24. A noble family's son, 13 years old, had been invited to join the palace musicians. 3 days later, his body was returned with injuries so extensive that the embalmer refused to prepare him for burial, claiming his life force had been damaged beyond repair. The family demanded justice. They were wealthy, connected, impossible to silence. So Pepi did something brilliant and terrible. He declared their son had been chosen for sacred transformation. His suffering had opened doorways to divine knowledge. The family should feel honored. Then he invited them to the palace to receive compensation. They were never seen again. This was when Pepi created the position that would industrialize his obsessions, the overseer of royal entertainments. Officially, it sounded ceremonial. In reality, this was a procurement operation that would eventually employ nearly 1,000 people across Egypt. The first overseer was a man named Keti, chosen specifically for his lack of conscience. Within months, he had established a network of scouts, transporters, guards, doctors, and disposers. He created detailed criteria for selection boys between 8 and 14. Specific heights, weights, skin tones. Even the sound of their voices was evaluated. Pepi preferred higher pitches because his aging ears could hear them better when they screamed. The honey rituals began when Pepi was 52 in his 46th year of rule. By then, individual victims no longer satisfied him. He needed spectacle. He needed ceremony. He needed what he called symphonies of sensation. The idea came from watching warehouse workers who had spilled honey and been swarmed by insects. Pepi observed a young worker covered in biting ants and experienced what witnesses described as a religious revelation. Here was suffering that came from nature itself, pain that could be blamed on sacred creatures, torture that looked like divine judgment. The first honey chamber was simple. A single room beneath the palace walls sealed with bitumen to contain sound drainage channels in the floor for fluids. But simple was never enough for Pepi. Within a year, it had expanded into a complex of 9 interconnected chambers, each serving a specific purpose. The preparation chamber, where boys were cleaned and oiled. The honey room for the main ritual. The beetle pit, where victims were submerged in thousands of carnivorous scarabs. The serpent chamber, for those who had developed resistance to insects. The water room with pools containing things that should not exist. The fire chamber, where controlled burning created specific types of pain. The recovery room, where victims were kept alive for repeated use. The disposal chamber, whose purpose needs no explanation. And at the center, the observation platform, where Pepi could watch everything. The honey itself became a precise science. Pure honey attracted insects, but not aggressively enough. Through systematic experimentation on early victims, palace torturers discovered the perfect formula. Honey mixed with human saliva changed its scent in ways that drove insects into a frenzy. Tears added salt that certain species craved. Blood attracted the ones that preferred protein. But the most effective ingredient was fear itself. The pheromones released by terrified children mixed into the honey created an irresistible attractant for predatory insects. The insects were cultivated with similar precision. Scarab beetles fed exclusively on raw meat until they associated flesh with food. Fire ants selected for venom potency and aggression. Wasps kept in constant agitation through smoke and vibration. Each species tested to determine optimal starvation periods for maximum violence. A typical session followed strict protocols. The selected boy would be brought in at sunset when certain insects were most active. He would be inspected for wounds that might cause premature death, then given a mixture of lotus wine and herbs, not to reduce pain, but to prevent loss of consciousness. Awareness was essential. The entire point was that they knew what was happening. The boy would be positioned on a stone platform carved with drainage channels, leather restraints at wrists and ankles tight enough to prevent escape, but loose enough to allow the writhing that Pepi enjoyed watching. Then came the honey application. Servants used brushes made from palm fronds to coat every surface of skin. Special attention was paid to the most sensitive areas, the places that would provoke the most dramatic reactions. The insects were released in calculated waves. First, the beetles, usually 50 to 100, which would consume the honey while also biting into flesh. The boys would begin struggling as dozens of mandibles pierced their skin simultaneously. Then came the ants, hundreds of them, each bite injecting venom that created burning trails across the honey-coated body. Finally, the wasps, whose stings caused immediate swelling that could close eyes, seal mouths, transform faces into unrecognizable masks of agony. Pepi would watch from his platform, occasionally calling out adjustments. More honey on the feet to attract beetles. Release additional ants, but only on the left side to create asymmetric pain. Remove the wasps, but leave the beetles to work longer. He treated each session like a performance he was directing, fine-tuning the suffering for maximum impact. Sessions could last 3 hours or more, paused and restarted multiple times to prevent death from shock. The boys who survived were taken to recovery chambers where skilled physicians would heal them just enough to endure another session. Some boys went through this dozens of times over months before finally dying or aging out of Pepi's interest. By year 70 of his reign, when Pepi was 76 years old, Egypt had completely reorganized itself around feeding one man's appetites. This was not corruption of an existing system. This was the creation of an entirely new architecture of atrocity. Consider the economics. Egypt produced more honey in Pepi's final 20 years than in the previous century combined. Entire agricultural regions that should have been growing grain were instead growing flowers for bees. This was during a period of climate change when the Nile floods were failing. While Egypt starved, its fields bloomed with flowers to make honey for torture. The human infrastructure was staggering. The overseer of royal entertainments commanded 4 regional directors. Each director managed 10 provincial coordinators. Each coordinator supervised 5 village scouts. That is 200 people whose only job was finding boys. Supporting them were hundreds more. Boat builders who modified vessels with hidden compartments for transport. Metal workers who forged child-sized restraints. Potters who created specialized vessels for insect cultivation. Farmers who bred specific insect species. Merchants who imported exotic creatures from distant lands. The selection criteria had become absurdly specific. Documents from this period list 47 separate physical requirements. Height had to be within a range of 2 fingers. Weight precise to half a deben. Skin tone was matched against color charts painted on pottery shards. Even the timbre of their screams was evaluated during initial procurement, with preference for tones that Pepi's aged ears could still detect. Villages developed desperate strategies to protect their children. Some claimed plagues that only affected boys of suitable age. Others reported mass drownings, raids by desert nomads, anything to explain the absence of children. The governor of Abydos claimed all his province's boys had been cursed with ugliness by an angry god. The governor of Hierakonpolis insisted flooding had washed 3 entire villages away. The governor of Edfu reported that jackals had developed a taste for children and taken them all. These lies never worked. The governors were executed, their families enslaved their replacements, immediately sending double quotas to prove loyalty. The message was clear: provide boys or become victims yourselves. Some regions tried different approaches. Wealthy families sent their sons to relatives in Nubia or Libya, claiming they had died from fever. Poor families had fewer options. Some deliberately scarred their sons' faces with hot metal. Others broke bones to create deformities. Some fed their boys potions that caused temporary illness. The lucky ones succeeded in making their children unsuitable. The unlucky ones saw their injured sons taken anyway, their deformities adding an extra dimension to Pepi's entertainment. The demographic impact defied comprehension. Some regions lost 70% of their male children over a 30-year period. Not from war, which would show battle injuries. Not from disease, which would affect all ages. These boys simply vanished. Villages near Memphis, closest to the palace, and most frequently harvested, show the most extreme collapse. Burial records from this period show almost no boy children dying of natural causes. Either they had developed immunity to all childhood diseases, which is impossible, or they were dying somewhere else, somewhere their families could not bury them. The resistance movements that formed were heroic and doomed. Groups of fathers who had lost sons began attacking procurement convoys. They called themselves the Fathers of the Lost. And for 6 months, they successfully freed dozens of boys and killed several scouts. Pepi's response was swift and horrific. Every male member of suspected resistance families, from newborns to grandfathers, was brought to Memphis and subjected to the honey rituals. But they were kept alive for days, their suffering prolonged through medical intervention, their families forced to watch. One story preserved in Nubian oral tradition tells of a village that chose collective suicide rather than surrender their children. When procurement scouts arrived, they found 800 bodies in the town square. Every family had drunk poison together rather than see their sons taken. The scouts collected the bodies of suitable boys anyway. Pepi reportedly had the corpses covered in honey and displayed them in the palace courtyard, furious at being denied living entertainment. By year 80 of Pepi's reign, Egypt was not just dying internally. It had become an international pariah, shunned by civilizations that had traded with it for millennia. A Sumerian tablet from this period contains merchant instructions that reveal the depth of foreign revulsion. Any trader who entered Egypt would be considered unclean and banned from temple grounds for a year. Any goods from Egypt would be burned without compensation. The tablet explains that Egypt had become the land where children enter palaces and do not leave, where the Pharaoh feeds on innocents like a lion feeds on gazelles. The Nubian kingdom, which had paid tribute to Egypt for centuries, not only stopped sending gold, but built fortifications specifically to prevent Egyptian raids for children. When an Egyptian force tried to cross the border, they found villages emptied, all children hidden in secret desert camps. A Nubian inscription from this period reads simply that the monster of Memphis could starve for want of southern gold, and southern children both. Even the mysterious sea peoples, those raiders who feared nothing, avoided Egyptian waters. A tablet from Crete describes Egyptian ports as cursed by gods who have turned their faces away from the land where abomination rules from a throne of murdered children. Merchants would sail hundreds of miles out of their way rather than risk contamination by Egyptian evil. The breakdown in trade created cascading failures. Egypt could not import tin needed for bronze production. Lebanese cedar for construction became unavailable. Incense from Punt, essential for religious ceremonies, vanished from markets. The economic isolation compounded the agricultural crisis from diverted honey production. Egypt was simultaneously starving and shunned, dying, and despised. Inside Egypt, even traditional supporters abandoned the throne. The powerful priesthood of Amun at Thebes, which had supported the monarchy for centuries, began distancing itself from Memphis. Temple inscriptions from this period never mentioned Pepi by name, referring only to the distant throne or the ancient one. Some temples claimed poverty when asked to contribute to palace activities. Others simply closed their doors and refused all communication with the capital. The military, once Egypt's pride, had withered to nothing. Young men refused to join an army that might redirect them to procurement duties. Officers deserted rather than lead raids for children. Entire garrisons abandoned their posts and fled to the desert, preferring life as bandits to service under Pepi. By year 85, Egypt effectively had no military beyond the palace guard, and even they were beginning to disappear in the night. As Pepi entered his 90s, his appetites had not diminished, but evolved into something even darker. The honey rituals that had once entertained him for weeks now barely held his attention for hours. He needed more victims, more variety, more intensity to feel anything through the numbness of 9 decades of absolute corruption. The palace complex expanded to accommodate industrial-scale horror. Where once there had been 9 chambers, now there were 27. Multiple sessions ran simultaneously. While one boy endured the honey ritual, another faced serpents. A third was in the beetle pit, a fourth in chambers that Egyptian records refused to describe even in their private texts. Pepi, now 96, and barely able to walk, would be carried between chambers on a golden litter, spending a few minutes observing each before moving to the next. The screams from different rooms created what one escaped servant later described as a symphony of the damned that could be heard throughout the palace, despite the thick walls built specifically to contain sound. The procurement system was collapsing. Provinces were empty of suitable boys. Villages had been depopulated. Even the palace guard now had to conduct armed raids to find victims. The pretense of divine selection had been abandoned for naked predation. Soldiers would descend on settlements at dawn, taking every boy who met the basic criteria, killing any who resisted. A papyrus fragment from this period hidden in a worker's tomb describes one such raid. The palace soldiers came, at dawn, took every boy who could walk but had not yet grown a beard, killed fathers who tried to protect their sons, burned houses of families who had hidden their children. When they left, 43 boys were in chains and 17 men were dead. Even within the palace, the system was breaking down. Servants fled rather than participate. Guards deserted rather than conduct raids. Administrators destroyed records rather than document atrocities. The complex machinery of procurement and torture that had operated for decades was falling apart, just as its architect reached peak depravity. The last recorded session, described by a palace guard who fled immediately afterward, involved something so horrific that even Greek historians who documented it centuries later refused to provide details. They would say only that it involved 40 boys' insects bred to impossible size and substances that should never touch human flesh. It lasted from sunset to dawn. None survived. And through it all, the 96-year-old Pharaoh smiled. 3 days later, Pepi II died in his sleep, clutching a piece of honeycomb. His mouth twisted in what servants described as an expression of eternal hunger. He had ruled for 94 years. He had outlived 8 generations of descendants. He had consumed approximately 50,000 boys. And he had never not once faced any consequences. The moment Pepi died, Egypt died with him. Not metaphorically, literally. The instant his death was confirmed, the palace erupted into chaos. But not mourning. Instead, there was a desperate race to destroy evidence. Documents were burned by the thousands. Not ceremonial burning, but frantic destruction. Servants threw armloads of papyrus into bonfires that burned for days. Stone inscriptions were chiseled away, sometimes taking entire walls with them. The honey chambers were filled with rubble and sealed with blocks so massive they could never be moved without destroying everything inside. The boys, still held in palace dormitories, presented a problem. Releasing them would mean acknowledging they existed. So they were sealed inside and left to die. Hundreds of children already damaged from repeated torture, slowly starving in darkness, because the truth of their existence was more terrible than their deaths. Pepi's successor, Merenre II, ruled for less than a year. His only significant act was overseeing the systematic erasure of his predecessor's crimes. Every record that mentioned procurement was destroyed. Every official who had participated was either executed or fled. Every piece of physical evidence of the honey chambers was buried or burned. Even Pepi's mummy was deliberately sabotaged. The priests responsible for preparing it for the afterlife instead ensured he would suffer in death. They removed organs that should have been preserved, used salts that would corrode rather than preserve, and positioned the body backward in its wrappings. They filled the stomach cavity with live insects that would consume the corpse from within. It was not mummification. It was posthumous revenge. The pyramid built for Pepi was deliberately constructed to fail inferior limestone that would crumble weak mortar that would not hold support beams positioned to eventually collapse. Within a century, the ceiling had crashed down onto the sarcophagus, crushing it, and the mummy within. The builders knew exactly what they were doing. They were ensuring that Pepi's remains would be destroyed by his own monument. Egypt itself fragmented immediately. The unified kingdom that had existed for 800 years shattered into competing territories within months. Central authority vanished. The irrigation systems that had made Egypt fertile collapsed from neglect. Trade routes permanently shifted away from Egyptian ports. The accumulated knowledge of centuries scattered as scribes fled to different regions. The demographic recovery would take centuries. Entire regions had been depopulated of young males. The generational impact meant not just missing individuals, but missing families, missing bloodlines, missing futures. Some areas never recovered their pre-Pepi populations. The social trauma passed through cultural memory, a fear so deep it shaped Egyptian politics for the next 1,000 years. What happened in ancient Egypt was not unique. It was simply the most extreme, most documented example of a pattern that repeats throughout history whenever absolute power combines with perverted appetite and unlimited time. The Roman Emperor Tiberius retreated to Capri, where he had young boys trained as his little minnows, swimming naked in his pools, trained to nibble between his legs while he bathed. The difference: Tiberius ruled for 23 years. Pepi ruled for 94. Gilles de Rais, the French nobleman who fought alongside Joan of Arc, retired to his castle, where he tortured and murdered somewhere between 80 and 200 children. The difference, he operated for 8 years before being caught. Pepi operated for 9 decades without consequence. Countess Elizabeth Bathory supposedly bathed in the blood of virgin girls, believing it would preserve her youth. Modern historians debate the exact number of her victims, somewhere between 30 and 600. Pepi's victims numbered in the tens of thousands, and there is no debate about their reality. What makes Pepi unique is not the nature of his crimes, but their scale and systematization. He turned child torture into a government function. He made procurement a bureaucratic process. He industrialized suffering in ways that would not be seen again until the 20th century, and even then never for such personal gratification. The psychology is disturbingly consistent across all these cases. It begins with power acquired too young or too absolutely. The normal human empathy circuits that develop through equal relationships never form. Other humans become objects, toys, sources of stimulation rather than beings with their own inner lives. Then comes the tolerance effect. Like any addiction, the stimulus must constantly increase to achieve the same response. What begins as curiosity becomes compulsion. What starts as individual incidents becomes systematic practice. The infrastructure of evil grows around the central appetite, normalizing atrocity through repetition and bureaucracy. The enablers follow predictable patterns too. First, they rationalize. It is the divine right of kings. It is necessary for stability. It is not as bad as rumored. Then they become complicit through small compromises. Looking away from one incident, facilitating one procurement, filing one false report. Each compromise makes the next easier until they are fully enmeshed in the machinery of evil. The victims are always the vulnerable children, the poor, those without protection or voice. They are selected precisely because their suffering will go unnoticed, their disappearance unexplained, their stories untold. In Pepi's case, he had the additional power to make their suffering into a religious ritual, to transform atrocity into theology. We tell ourselves these are ancient horrors, irrelevant to our enlightened age. We are wrong. The pattern Pepi established, the systematic procurement and consumption of the vulnerable by the powerful, continues in different forms. The private jets to private islands, the mysterious disappearances, the powerful people who seem to operate above all law, the infrastructures that protect them, the victims who are never believed, the evidence that gets sealed or destroyed, the investigations that mysteriously stop, the perpetrators who die peacefully in their beds, taking their secrets with them. What Pepi proved is that with enough power and time, any atrocity can be normalized. His nobles accepted the honey chambers as a divine ritual. His priests blessed the procurement as a sacred duty. His people surrendered their children as a religious obligation. An entire civilization restructured itself around one man's perversion because that man had been declared a god. Modern predators may not have the title of God King, but they have wealth that might as well be divine. They have connections that protect them better than any palace guard. They have systems that procure victims as efficiently as any Egyptian overseer. And they have something Pepi never had the ability to operate globally, to move between jurisdictions, to hide behind corporations and foundations and charitable fronts. The methods have evolved, but the pattern remains. The gradual normalization of the unacceptable. The infrastructure that develops to facilitate and protect. The official silence that enables continuation. The victims who disappear into modern chambers that may not use honey and insects, but achieve the same ends through different means. Return now to that torch-lit chamber where you stand as a young soldier watching a honey-covered boy writhe as insects consume him. You want to run, but cannot. You want to help, but dare not. You are trapped in a system that has normalized horror, that has made atrocity into ritual, that has transformed children's screams into background noise. That boy died 200 years ago. We do not know his name, his village, his mother's lullabies, his favorite games. We know only that he existed because his bones were found in a mass grave with hundreds of others all showing similar trauma patterns. All children, all forgotten, except as statistical evidence of systematic evil. Multiply him by 50,000. 50,000 boys who had names their mothers whispered when they were born. 50,000 futures erased for an old man's entertainment. 50,000 families destroyed, communities traumatized, bloodlines ended. Each one believed they were nothing would become, nothing would be forgotten as nothing. In one sense, they were right. They have no monuments, no inscriptions, no individual memorials. They exist only as demographic shadows, statistical anomalies, small skeletons in mass graves that authorities still refuse to fully excavate. Their names are lost forever. But in another sense, they achieved what Pepi never could. They brought down the world's greatest civilization. Their collective absence created a wound that Egypt never healed. Their suffering ended the Old Kingdom more definitively than any invasion or natural disaster could have. They conquered through absence, destroyed through being destroyed. Pepi died at approximately 100 years old, peacefully believing himself divine. He faced no earthly justice, experienced no consequences, never knew a moment of the terror he inflicted. His pyramid still stands, damaged but present. His name appears in every chronology of ancient Egypt. He is remembered, recorded, academically acknowledged. But his victims won something greater than memory. They won truth. Their bones speak louder than any inscription. Their absence echoes longer than any monument. Their stolen futures judge more harshly than any god. They are history's loudest silence, screaming across 4,000 years that unlimited power creates unlimited horror. That humans given absolute authority become absolutely monstrous. That the price of one man's pleasure can be an entire civilization's collapse. Modern visitors to Saqqara can see Pepi's pyramid in the distance, a crumbling pile of stones that once reached toward heaven. The guards will tell you it is closed for restoration. It has been closed for 40 years. It will remain closed because some doors should not be opened. Some evidence should not be displayed. Some truths are too heavy for tourism. The honey markets of Cairo still sell golden sweetness that tourists buy without knowing its historical weight. Some Egyptian families, those with lineages stretching back 4 millennia, still refuse to eat honey. They cannot say why. It is simply tradition passed from parent to child. Do not eat honey. Do not ask why. Just remember that sweetness can mask horror, that golden beauty can attract suffering, that some things should not be consumed no matter how appealing they appear. Somewhere beneath the Egyptian sand, in chambers that will never be opened, evidence waits. More bones of children, more vessels of honey mixed with human remains, more proof of systematic evil that operated for longer than most kingdoms exist. The full truth may never be uncovered. Some doors remain sealed not from respect for the dead, but from fear of what the living might learn about the human capacity for sustained monstrosity. The 12-year-old boy covered in honey from our opening died in agony 200 years ago, but his death echoes through time as a warning. This is what happens when power has no limits. This is what humans do when consequences do not exist. This is why we must remember even what we wish we could forget. That boy is still screaming across the millennia. The question is not whether we can hear him. The question is whether we are listening. Whether we recognize the same patterns emerging in different forms, whether we will notice the next Pepi before another 50,000 children disappear into modern chambers of power. History does not repeat, but it rhymes. And the rhyme of Pepi II, the rhythm of procurement and consumption, the meter of power devouring innocence, that rhyme continues. We just call it different names now. We dress it in different rituals. We pretend it is conspiracy theory rather than conspiracy fact. But the bones remember the statistics, remember the demographic shadows. Remember. And sometimes, in the silence between heartbeats, if you listen carefully, you can still hear them. 50,000 children screaming in honey-covered agony, warning us that monsters are not born, but made. That evil is not inherent, but constructed. That any civilization is only 94 years of unchecked power away from becoming ancient Egypt under Pepi II. The Pharaoh is dead. His victims are dust. But the pattern lives waiting for the next alignment of absolute power, perverted appetite, and unlimited time. Waiting to build new chambers, recruit new overseers, procure new victims. Waiting to prove again that humans given godlike power will commit godlike atrocities. Unless we remember, unless we listen, unless we learn that some appetites must never be fed, some powers must never be absolute, some reigns must never last 94 years. The honey-covered boy from 2200 BC died for many reasons, but perhaps he can serve one purpose to remind us that civilization is always one monster away from collapse, and that monster is never born. He is always made, and we are the ones who make him.